At holiday lunch, Mom told me to leave and stop relying on the family, quietly packed, then announced they'd lost every financial benefit I provided. Her face went blank. My mom looked me dead in the eyes mid-bite of honey ham and said, "It's time you stopped relying on us. You need to grow up." I was 42. There wasn't even a hint of hesitation in her voice, no crack in the surface that might have hinted at a joke or even one of her awkward bone-dry teases that landed somewhere between uncomfortable and plain cruel. No, this was sharp. This was aimed like she'd been waiting years to say it. The room got quiet. The clatter of forks, the squeak of Uncle Larry's chair, even the fake laughter from the kids' table, it all just stopped. I hadn't even finished chewing. Holiday lunches in our family had always been more about performance than connection. The roast was dry, the wine cheap, the conversations loaded. Everyone knew which buttons to avoid pushing, yet they hover their fingers over them anyway. Every Thanksgiving or Christmas or welcome spring lunch turned into this odd little play where we all pretended we liked each other for the sake of tradition. My father, Carl, arranged the centerpiece like he was preparing an altar. My brother Steve always showed up late, usually half drunk, still in his work boots and smelling like diesel. And Bobby, my younger brother, clung to his role as family martyr, always ready to sacrifice his own comfort for the sake of appearances and to remind us all of it. I sat at the long oak table they'd had since I was a kid, one of the few things in that house that hadn't broken, burned, or walked away. There were 12 of us that day, 3 siblings, 2 cousins, both parents, a handful of significant others, and me. The odd one, the single one, the one with no husband, no kids, and apparently no place at that table. The jab didn't even come out of nowhere. I brought a bottle of red from a Napa vineyard I'd visited last month, placed it gently beside the rolls. Bobby glanced at the label and snorted before muttering something about California wine and lonely women. No one laughed, not because it wasn't funny, but because everyone knew he meant it. Bobby had always carried that bitter tone like a trophy. He earned by staying close to home, raising 3 kids under a leaking roof, and calling it strength. I ignored it the way I usually did. I learned early that silence had power, and it rattled them more than any clapback I could offer. So I just poured myself a glass, offered a small toast to being here, and swallowed the taste of resentment like it was the dried turkey my father overcooked every year. But my mom, she didn't let things sit. She never had. If something didn't align with her outdated definition of family, she felt entitled to fix it, which really meant shame it until it either bent or broke. And apparently today was the day she decided I'd broken something. "It's time you stopped relying on us." That line hit harder than it should have. Not because it was true, but because it was so far from reality, it felt like a bad dream, relying on them. I had paid for the roof they were sitting under, the water running in their pipes, the heat keeping them warm. Even the new oven my dad used to overcook that damn ham. They were all mine. Quietly, efficiently, anonymously mine. They had no idea. The words buzzed in my ears. My instinct was to defend myself, to list the 1,000 things I had covered, fixed, saved, or hidden to keep the illusion intact. But then something strange happened. I felt calm, like someone had finally cracked the glass, and I didn't need to hold it together anymore. I glanced around the table, noticed the way no one looked at me, not even my dad, who stirred his glass of water like he hoped it would make him invisible. No one spoke. No one stopped her because they didn't think she was wrong. I wiped my mouth slowly with a cloth napkin, careful not to rush. I folded it once, then again. I placed it neatly beside my plate, the untouched ham now cold, the wine glass half full. I didn't say a word, just stood up, walked to the coat closet by the front door, and opened it like I was stepping into something sacred. You ever hear the kind of silence that only happens when everyone realizes they screwed up, but it's already too late? That's what I heard behind me, chairs shifting slightly, forks tapping plates again, and awkward little rhythms. Someone's kids started humming. My coat felt heavier than usual. Maybe because this time it wasn't just keeping me warm. It was carrying the weight of every unpaid debt, every thankless gift, every swallowed insult from the last 20 years. As I slipped my arms through the sleeves, I felt the smile tug at the corner of my mouth. Not a big one, just enough to know I'd reached the edge of something. Maybe freedom, maybe vengeance, probably both. I zipped up and turned around slowly. No drama, no tears, no long speech. "Thanks for lunch," I said. And with that, I walked out smiling. The door closed behind me with the kind of finality you usually only hear in movies, the kind where a main character walks away from an explosion and doesn't bother to look back. Except this explosion wasn't fiery, it was cold and quiet. The kind that leaves a ringing in your ears and an aftertaste you can't place. I stepped into the cold December air with nothing but my wallet in one pocket and my keys tight in my fist, like I was gripping onto something real in a world that suddenly felt fake. Nobody followed. Nobody called out. Nobody even asked if I was okay, and it told me everything I needed to know. The silence was confirmation. And I wasn't surprised anymore. My car was parked at the curb right where I'd left it. I slid into the driver's seat like I'd done 1,000 times before, except this time something inside me had shifted. I wasn't just driving away from a family lunch. I was leaving something bigger behind, something I'd been carrying on my back for decades without a single thank you or acknowledgement. I sat there for a minute, letting the engine idle, watching the condensation cloud up the windows while my breath slowed down from the storm I hadn't shown them. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. One text, probably Bobby, probably something passive-aggressive and poorly spelled, but I didn't bother looking, not yet. When I got home, the condo felt different. Maybe it was me. Maybe something about the act of walking away without an argument, without a single tear, had cracked a window inside me I didn't know was sealed shut. I kicked off my boots and stood in the entryway for a second, just breathing. The lights were still on. The apartment still smelled like the pine candle I lit that morning, but I felt like a stranger in my own space. Like I'd aged 10 years in the span of a 90-minute lunch with people who thought they knew me, but hadn't bothered to really look in 20 years. I poured myself a glass of the good wine, the kind I never brought to their house because I knew it would go unappreciated, poured into red Solo cups and left to oxidize beside a tray of undercooked green beans. I didn't toast. I didn't say anything. I just drank slowly like I was trying to taste the moment instead of just survive it. Then I went into my room, pulled out my suitcase from under the bed, and started packing. I wasn't going anywhere. Not really. But something in me needed the ritual. The act of moving, of gathering my things, of preparing to leave, even symbolically, was a kind of balm. I folded clothes with care, not because they were expensive, but because they were mine. All mine. No one helped me buy them. No one had ever done my laundry. No one had given me anything without strings attached. That thought burned a little, but not enough to stop me. I packed 4 bags in 3 minutes. That's 45 seconds a bag, right? I'm not a math genius, but that felt about accurate. The speed didn't come from panic. It came from clarity. I wasn't running from anything. I was organizing the evidence. Each piece of clothing, every folder of paperwork, each drawer emptied into a duffel, felt like another line drawn in the sand. I was building a border. And this time, I wasn't leaving the gate unlocked. Somewhere between bag 2 and bag 3, I remembered Steve's DUI. It had been 3 years ago, maybe 4. He'd called me in the middle of the night, voice slurred, asking if I could help a sister out. I didn't hesitate. I wired the bail money, paid for the lawyer, and even covered the cost of that ridiculous online driving course he took hungover. He never paid me back, never even said thanks. Just told our cousin's son some lie about a rich friend who helped him out, probably to protect his ego. Then there was Bobby's kid, my nephew Mason. Smart kid, awkward as hell, couldn't sit through a full sentence without chewing his hoodie strings. I paid his community college tuition when Bobby said he just couldn't manage it this semester. That was 2 years ago, and they still act like I just helped pick out school supplies. Not that I covered $6,000 in fees, and books, and fees again. Always with the damn fees. And let's not forget the house, the one we grew up in. The one my mom pretends she worked her whole life to keep. The one my dad decorates every holiday like it's a spread for a magazine no one reads. I paid off the last of their mortgage 6 years ago in silence, in full. No interest, no agreement, just a phone call with a banker and a handwritten Christmas card that said, "Thanks for the memories," as if I were a tourist in my own family history. By the time I finished my wine, the spreadsheet was already open on my laptop. I kept track of it all. Every dollar, every favor, every forgiven loan and forgotten debt. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because I needed proof for myself that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't just imagining being used. I hovered over a recurring auto payment, Mom and Dad's utilities. It was set to process in 2 days. I clicked cancel. No drama, no flames, no message, just a quiet little deletion in a system they never even knew I controlled. It felt like lighting a candle in a room they thought was theirs, just to remind them they were guests in a life they didn't pay for. By the time they noticed what was missing, I was halfway through a bottle of wine in my spreadsheet. It started with the insurance, because that was the easiest lever to pull and frankly the most overdue. They never should have been on my plan to begin with. Technically, it was against policy, a little loophole I nudged open with some paperwork magic and a few favors from HR back when my mom's coverage lapsed and my father started having those dizzy spells. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself family came first, even when they didn't deserve to be first or even second. But now, 2 days after the fork and the silence in the coat closet, I was tired of telling myself lies just to make their lives easier at the cost of my own. So I picked up the phone, called HR, and said the words I thought I'd never say out loud. Remove Carol and Carl from my dependent list. Just like that. No emotion, no justifications. The woman on the other end asked me twice if I was sure. I said yes, both times, without hesitation. The paperwork hit my inbox 10 minutes later, and I signed it electronically before my coffee even finished brewing. I didn't smile when I hit submit. I didn't cry either. I just sat there for a long moment, letting the silence confirm something inside me. This wasn't revenge. This was correction. Next was the house, not the main one they lived in. I'd already let that go emotionally, even if my bank account hadn't. But the other one, the lake cabin they always referred to as the family retreat. I used to drive up during my college years and right after, clean out the gutters, restock the propane tanks, pay the plumber when the pipes froze because Dad never drained them properly. But once they made it clear I wasn't welcome at family gatherings there, it became more like Bobby's weekend escape, a place for him and whatever girlfriend he was yelling at this season to go play pretend domesticity while I covered the bills like a silent sponsor. The utilities were in my name: internet, water, electricity. I didn't even have to log into more than 2 accounts. Cancel, cancel, cancel. Like flipping switches in my head, one by one. I didn't leave a note, didn't warn them. Let them figure it out when the lights cut off and the Wi-Fi died mid-TikTok. Let them sit in the cold for once. Let them see how much warmth costs when someone else isn't footing the bill. Then came the taxes. Oh, the delicious joy of clean, precise paperwork. See, for years, I'd been filing deductions they never knew about, gifts listed as dependent support, education expenses, healthcare premiums, property maintenance costs. The irony was that while they whispered behind my back about how selfish I was, I'd been saving their asses on my tax returns just to keep the books from screaming at me louder than they already did. But this year, I decided they should finally get a copy. I printed out the statements, highlighted the lines where their names appeared, drew little arrows with sticky notes saying things like your braces and your tuition and your overdue car note. I mailed them out in 3 separate envelopes, one to each household, because I wanted them to open those pages alone and really sit with it. No buffer, no group excuse, just cold, hard math in black and white. The numbers weren't emotional. The deductions didn't lie. They painted a picture that words never could, and I wanted them to see the masterpiece they'd made of my generosity. Bobby called, of course. His number popped up on my screen, and I let it ring twice before answering because I knew he'd take that as disrespect. And he did. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he snapped, before I could even say hello, his voice already pitched with the kind of outrage reserved for people who'd lived off someone else's kindness so long they think it's a right. "You can't just turn off the utilities like that. There's a leak in the kitchen, and Mason's coming up this weekend." I cut him off, calm as ever. "I'm not your landlord, Bobby, or your sponsor, or your ATM. He gasped like I'd slapped him. "Wow, so this is it? You finally think you're too good for us?" "No," I said, smiling a little despite myself. "You've thought that for years. I just stopped apologizing for it." That's when he launched into a tirade that felt like a greatest hits album of old grievances. How I always acted superior, how I moved away and forgot where I came from, how money changed me. I let him finish because I'd already heard it all before, just never so loud. And when he finally ran out of steam, I hit him with the last card I had. I paid for your kids' braces, Bobby. You were supposed to pay me back. You never even tried. Silence. It sat there like a rock in the throat of the conversation. I was going through stuff, he finally muttered. Weren't we all? I said, then hung up. No screaming, no slammed doors, just the quiet click of a boundary finally being enforced. I didn't expect to feel good about it, but I didn't feel guilty either. And for the first time in maybe a decade, that felt like progress. 2 days later, there was a knock on my condo door. Not a knock, really, more like 3 soft thuds, hesitant, like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure if they wanted to be there. I opened it, and there she was, my mother, Carol Marie Harper, wearing the same old cardigan she'd had since I was 16, eyes bloodshot, face pale, and for the first time in her entire life, she didn't have a single thing to say. I stood there in the doorway staring at my mother like I was looking at a ghost, not because she was sick or frail or anything so simple, but because something behind her eyes had shifted. And for the first time in my life, the woman looked uncertain. She didn't speak. I didn't invite her in. We just stood like that, her holding her purse in both hands, like she was waiting for permission, and me blocking the entrance like I was guarding a vault. When the silence got too heavy, I stepped aside just enough to let her walk in, and she did, slow and unsure as if the floor might reject her too. She didn't stay long, maybe 10 minutes, most of it in silence with her sitting on the edge of my couch and me leaning against the wall with my arms crossed. She asked one question eventually, "Why are you doing this?" And when I didn't answer right away, she nodded like she already knew. That was it. No apology. No, I was wrong. Not even an attempt to explain away the damage. Just that question and her quiet departure, like a woman leaving a funeral. What she didn't know, what none of them seemed to know, was that this reckoning had been building for years, quietly and methodically, like rain slowly rotting the foundation of a house. The collapse always looked sudden from the outside, but inside I'd been feeling the cracks for decades. It started with the gambling. I was maybe 22 when I figured it out, though I'd suspected something was off before then. There were whispers, missing money, strange late-night phone calls, and debt collectors that called the house looking for Tommy like they were old friends. The woman who always lectured us about personal responsibility and hard work was deep in it. Casinos, bets on college games, even some shady poker nights with guys I only knew by first names. When it finally came to a head, it wasn't a confession. It was a demand. She needed $10,000 to keep the house from going into foreclosure after refinancing it to cover a losing streak. I emptied the savings I had put away from my job out of college. I didn't even argue. I told myself I was protecting the family name, that if anyone found out, it would destroy my father. But what I didn't know then, and I do now, is that guilt is the stick families use to keep the strong ones quiet, and I was the quietest damn mule they had. That was the first step. Then came others. Car repairs for Steve when he wrecked his pickup during a weekend bender, a new furnace after a carbon monoxide scare in the dead of winter, Bobby's emergency dental surgery when he cried on the phone and said, "Please don't make me go through this with no help." Each time I told myself it was just this once. Each time I paid, and each time they took without flinching. They never called it an inheritance, but that's what it was, in a twisted kind of way. When I asked about the future, about the will, about the house or the cabin, or anything with value, my father would always say things like, "We're giving it to you now, honey," in the form of love and family. What they meant was, "We'll drain you while we're alive, and you'll get nothing when we're gone because we never had anything to give in the first place." Last week, I got an email from my father. The subject line said, "Please read," and the body was filled with Bible verses about forgiveness, kindness, obedience, and the burden of pride. He quoted Proverbs. He quoted Corinthians. He threw in his favorite, "Honor thy father and mother." He didn't mention the money or the insurance or the years I spent fixing what they broke. He just laid it out like I was the one who had sinned, like turning off the faucet made me Pharaoh during the plagues. At the bottom, he wrote, "We miss you. Your mother hasn't been the same. Jesus wouldn't turn his back on family." I replied the next morning, "It was one line. I forgave you. I just didn't forget." No closing, no signature, just the truth, plain and unadorned. I thought it would be the end of it for a while. Maybe they'd lick their wounds, gossip among themselves, try to find new ways to paint me as cruel or cold or ungrateful. But instead, 2 days later, I got a notice in the mail, a legal envelope, thick and official looking, sent certified to make sure I signed for it. Inside was a petition filed by my mother, Carol M. Harper, requesting a reversal of the property transfer for the cabin, citing mental duress and lack of informed consent. She was trying to take it back. I stared at the paper for a long time, sitting alone in my kitchen, coffee going cold beside me. I wasn't surprised. Angry, yes. Betrayed, maybe. But surprised? No. This was exactly who she was. A woman who would take your money, your silence, and your forgiveness, then demand your dignity on top of it. And that's when I knew this wasn't just about a house or a title or money. It was about control, about never letting me be more than the daughter who showed up, paid up, and shut up. But that version of me no longer existed. And now she was about to find out what it really cost to bite the hand that fed her. The moment I unfolded the legal notice at my kitchen table and saw my mother's name printed under petitioner, something in me snapped, but not in the way most people imagine snapping. It wasn't violent. I didn't scream or throw anything across the room. I didn't call anyone, no angry texts, no tearful voice memos to friends. What I did was finish my cold coffee, rinse out the mug, and walk calmly into my office where a slim black binder labeled Family Property Lake House had been sitting untouched on the bottom shelf for 3 years. I pulled it out, flipped to the tab, and there it was, my insurance policy. Not the kind you file with a claims adjuster, but the kind that proves you were never as naive as they hoped. The clause was one I'd insisted on when I transferred the deed to them. It had been a gift, as my parents insisted on calling it. Though everyone knew the only thing I got in return was my name on the deed and the responsibility for all expenses. When we made the transfer official, I had my lawyer include a reversion clause, legal language that essentially meant if at any point the property was sold, transferred to a third party, or if the original recipients attempted to exclude me from decisions regarding the property, it would revert back to me. No questions asked, no court battle, just automatic reversion, clean and silent. I paid extra to make it bulletproof. That was the moment I stopped being their benefactor and started being their contingency plan. Sitting across from my lawyer the next morning, I laid the document in front of him with a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in years. He glanced through it, adjusted his glasses, and smiled in that slow way that lawyers do when they know the other side is about to be blindsided. "You were smart to put this in," he said, tapping the clause with his pen. "She has no idea what she walked into." But I did. I had known for years that eventually the gratitude would rot and resentment would bloom in its place. They didn't like owing me. Not really. It pricked at their pride. It twisted their memories until they could barely remember the times I'd saved them from ruin, but could recite every moment I'd said no, or disappeared, or failed to show up for one more draining holiday. What they hated most wasn't that I had power. It was that I had the option to leave, and now I had finally taken it. When I asked to meet with them, I chose the place carefully. Not a lawyer's office or anyone's home. I picked the diner on 5th and Kennedy, the one we used to go to after church when I was still trying to earn their approval, before I realized that kind of love came with too many receipts. I sat at a corner booth under flickering lights and watched the 4 of them, Mom, Dad, Bobby, and Steve, walk in together like some weary parade of bad decisions, dressed in heavy coats and heavier silence. No one ordered. No one made small talk. My mom looked everywhere but at me, and Bobby chewed his thumbnail, like it might give him a good enough excuse to avoid eye contact. I waited a full minute before sliding a thick folder across the table. It had copies of the clause, a breakdown of all the financial support I'd provided since I was 23, and a final sheet titled, "What I'm No Longer Willing to Do." They didn't speak as they flipped through the pages. Steve squinted at a highlighted number near the bottom and muttered, "You paid that much for my rehab?" But I didn't answer. I just kept watching their faces shift as the truth they'd ignored for years landed in front of them like a quiet, undeniable storm. Finally, my mom cleared her throat. "Why now?" she asked, voice low, hands shaking just slightly over the edge of the folder. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because I realized I was the only one holding this family together. And instead of being grateful, you treated me like a burden. like I was lucky to be tolerated. Her mouth opened slightly, then shut. Nothing came out. I think in that moment, she genuinely didn't have the words, not because she didn't want to fight back, but because she had finally run out of lies to lean on. My dad looked like he might cry, but for once, I didn't feel compelled to comfort him. Bobby looked furious, but he always did when someone else controlled the narrative. Steve just looked tired. I suppose that was the most honest version of him I'd ever seen. The silence stretched between us like a canyon, and I could feel the weight of every unspoken truth pressing down on the table. My mom's eyes darted to the dollar bill, then back to my face, searching for some crack in my resolve that she could wedge open with guilt or manipulation. But I was done being their emotional ATM, done being the family safety net that they kicked through whenever it was convenient. You know what the worst part is? I said, my voice steady and quiet. It's not even the money. It's that you convinced yourselves I owed it to you, like my success was somehow your investment paying dividends, when the truth is I succeeded despite you, not because of you. Bobby's face flushed red. That's not fair. I cut him off. You want to talk about fair? Let's talk about fair. Let's talk about how I missed my college graduation because I was working extra shifts to cover Steve's gambling debts. Let's talk about how I've spent every holiday for the past 15 years listening to passive-aggressive comments about my lifestyle choices while I quietly paid for the roof over your heads. Steve shifted uncomfortably in his seat, finally looking up from the papers. We never asked you to. The word came out harder than I intended, but I didn't soften it. You never asked because you knew I'd say yes. You counted on it. You built your entire financial strategy around my inability to watch this family fall apart. And then you had the audacity to call me selfish when I finally started saying no. My dad's voice was barely a whisper. We thought you liked helping. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I did like helping at first, when I thought it was temporary, when I thought you were grateful, when I thought it meant something to you that I was sacrificing pieces of my own life to keep yours comfortable. The fluorescent light above our booth flickered, casting intermittent shadows across their faces. In those brief moments of darkness, they looked older, smaller somehow. Not like the towering figures of authority I'd spent my childhood trying to please, but like what they really were, people who had mistaken my love for weakness and my generosity for obligation. Do you know what I could have done with that money? I continued, pulling out my phone and opening the calculator app. The mortgage I paid off, $127,000. That could have been a down payment on a house twice the size of what I'm living in now. Steve's legal fees and rehab costs, $23,000. That was a year of therapy I didn't get because I was too busy fixing everyone else's problems to address my own. I scrolled through the numbers on my screen, each one a memory of a sacrifice they'd forgotten or dismissed. Bobby's kids' tuition, his dental work, his car repairs, $31,000. That was the trip to Europe I never took, the art classes I never signed up for, the savings account I never built. My mom finally found her voice, though it cracked when she spoke. We didn't know. You didn't want to know, I corrected her. There's a difference. You wanted the benefits without the responsibility. You wanted the safety net without acknowledging who was weaving it. Thread by thread, year after year. The waitress appeared at our table, coffee pot in hand, but took one look at our faces and retreated without a word. Smart woman. The tension radiating from our booth could have curdled milk. You want to know what really broke me? I asked, leaning back in the booth. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the lack of gratitude. It was Thanksgiving 2 years ago when Bobby introduced me to his girlfriend's parents as his weird sister who thinks she's better than everyone. And you all laughed. You sat there and laughed while he reduced me to a punchline. Bobby's face went pale. I was joking. Were you? I met his eyes directly. Because it didn't feel like a joke when Mom nodded along, or when Steve added that bit about how I forgot where I came from. It felt like a consensus, like you'd all been talking about me behind my back and finally decided to let me in on the joke. The papers rustled as my dad's hand shook slightly. He was staring at a line item that detailed the Christmas gifts I'd bought for everyone's kids over the years. Gifts that had been attributed to other family members because, as my mom once told me, it would just confuse them to know their aunt bought this. Even my generosity had to be anonymous, I said, watching his face. God forbid the kids actually knew who was making their Christmas mornings possible. Can't have them thinking Aunt Sherry cares about them more than their own parents, right? The weight of 20 years of resentment was finally finding its voice, and I couldn't stop now, even if I wanted to. You erased me for my own kindness. You took credit for my sacrifices. You made me a ghost in my own family story. And then you had the nerve to tell me I was relying on you. Steve cleared his throat. What do you want from us, Sherry? An apology? You want us to grovel? I want you to see me, I said simply. For once in your lives, I want you to see me as something other than a resource to be managed or a problem to be solved. I want you to understand that I'm not your backup plan, your emergency fund, or your consolation prize. I'm your daughter, your sister, and I deserve better than this. The silence that followed was different from the others. This one felt final, like the last breath before a long winter. My mom's makeup had started to smudge around her eyes, but I didn't feel the familiar urge to comfort her. That instinct had died somewhere between the holiday lunch and this moment. The lake house, I said, tapping the clause in the folder, was my test. I wanted to see if you could appreciate something without trying to control it, own it, or take it away from me. You failed the test spectacularly. I pulled out my business card and wrote a phone number on the back. This is my lawyer's direct line. If you want to contest the reversion clause, that's your right. But know that every legal document, every financial record, every text message, and email is already in his possession. You'll be fighting with evidence, not emotions. Standing up felt like shedding a skin I'd worn too long. The booth seemed smaller now, the diner cheaper. The whole scene exactly what it was, the final act of a play that should have closed years ago. I reached into my wallet, pulled out a folded dollar bill, and placed it in the center of the table. This is your inheritance, I said flatly. Because that's all that's left. Everything else? I already gave it, and you didn't even notice. I stood up, left the dollar, and walked toward the door. Nobody followed. Not this time. I felt the weight of 100 old arguments trying to rise behind me, but none of them stuck. Not anymore. Outside, the winter air bit into my cheeks as I walked back to my car. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew they were still sitting there, surrounded by papers and silence, finally forced to see the cost of everything they had dismissed. I didn't need them to apologize. I just needed them to finally see me, and now they had. Maybe we'd speak again. Maybe we wouldn't. Maybe one day someone would call me when one of them got sick, or when a holiday rolled around and they needed a warm body at the table to make it feel full. Maybe I'd go. Maybe I wouldn't. But for now, the only thing I knew for sure was that I hadn't lost them. They had lost me. That night, back in my condo, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even pour another glass of wine. I sat on the couch, legs tucked beneath me, staring at the single lamp glowing in the corner of the room. The quiet didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. For years, I'd been the scaffolding holding up a crumbling house, convincing myself that if I just braced harder, held longer, maybe the walls wouldn't collapse. But scaffolding isn't meant to last forever. It's meant to come down once the structure is sound. And my family? They were never sound. They were rotting beams covered in fresh paint, and I was done pretending otherwise. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The city outside my window was just starting to stir, the sky washed in that bluish-gray light that makes everything look colder than it is. I brewed coffee and opened my laptop. For the first time in years, there was no spreadsheet waiting for me. No balance sheet of debts owed and favors hidden. I'd closed every account, cut every string. Instead, I opened a blank document. At the top, I typed, "What I owe myself." The cursor blinked at me like a metronome, steady and patient. I wrote the first line without hesitation. Peace of mind. The second came just as fast. Freedom to choose who deserves my time. The third took longer, but when it landed, I felt my throat tighten. Permission to stop apologizing for surviving on my own terms. By noon, the page was filled. Not with numbers, not with debts, but with promises. Promises to myself. I printed it out and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk where old receipts and overdue reminders used to live. It felt like hanging a new kind of contract, one where the only signature that mattered was mine. A week passed. No phone calls, no surprise visits, no certified letters. The silence stretched, but it didn't suffocate. It gave me room to think, room to breathe. I started taking long walks in the evenings, through streets I'd lived on for years, but never really noticed. The bakery on the corner that always smelled like cinnamon. The little park where kids carved their names into the wooden benches. It was like waking up in a city I'd never seen before, even though it had always been mine. Then, one afternoon, as I sat on a bench near the river, My phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. Sherry? The voice was soft, hesitant. It was my cousin, Anna. We hadn't spoken in years, not since she moved out west. Yeah, I said, cautious. I heard what happened. About the family. About the cabin. She paused, like she was deciding how much truth to spill. I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. Nobody ever stood up to them before. For a second, I didn't know what to say. Compliments from family had always come laced with conditions, but Anna's voice was steady, warm, free of agenda. Thanks, I finally whispered, and for once I believed it. When the call ended, I sat there a long time, watching the water ripple under the bridge. For the first time in decades, I felt something close to hope. Not the fragile kind that breaks under the weight of expectation, but the steady kind that grows in silence, rooted deep, impossible to shake. Because the truth was, I hadn't walked away empty. I hadn't lost my family. I had gained myself. And that was worth more than any inheritance, any apology, any seat at their table could ever be.